Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode. Today, I am talking to Rick Houston. He's a former editor of NASCAR Scene, as well as host of the Scene Vault podcast, as well as the glorious white knuckled, God fearing, spun out, and half turned over racing stories podcast. That is a mouthful. Rick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome, man. Do you need to take a breather after reading that name off?
I feel like I have to. Whenever they came with the name, at first I was like, man, that's kind of like a strange name. And I'm like, well, it's kind of hard to forget it because it just.
Well, that was Mike Davis's idea. I got to credit him with that.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah, yeah,
Okay. We know who the evil professor is that came up with that then. But yeah. Um,
yes, yeah, yeah.
so I guess jumping into it, Rick, do you remember like the first time that you were introduced to NASCAR?
I absolutely do. I grew up a baseball fan. I was hardcore into baseball. I collected baseball cards and memorabilia. At one time, I had over 100,000 baseball cards and was just really immersed in that world. But my hero was Pete Rose. And he, of course, went through all his issues in the late 1980s and got banned in 1989. And so without Pete Rose, baseball didn't hold as much of an allure to me or for me. And my best friend in high school, his name is Joey Step. He was a race fan, and his mom, Sandy, is by far the most passionate race fan I've ever known, hands down, without a doubt. There's no discussion about who's number one. She is the most passionate. And I remember going over to their house one Sunday afternoon in February 1989, and there happened to be a race on, and it was the Daytona 500. And to see those cars in such close competition and to be able to see some of the personalities that were involved and to see the passion with which Sandy and Joe and Sandy's husband, Joe Sr., and Joe's sister, Jennifer, to see the passion that they had for the sport drew me in immediately. And I'm not the kind of person who can just be interested in something. Um, Sandy subscribed to a magazine at that time called Grand National Scene, a newspaper at that time called Grand National Scene. And so I picked up that issue. I picked up an issue there in their living room, and I started thumbing through it. And from that moment on, it became my goal to write for that newspaper one day. And it wasn't enough for me to read Winston Cup Scene. I had to go to work for Winston Cup Scene. And so that started a journey that led me to starting work for Winston Cup Scene in November of 1994.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's the thing is when you have something, because I know for me with NASCAR, a bunch of my friends never grew up around it. They were like, it's cars that go around in a circle. But when I took them to their first race, they just immediately were like, this is cool. You know, you see it in person, you see the people watching it, you realize, well, there's got to be something to this if you have,
Right.
80,000 people show up to watch this thing happen.
And the crazy thing is, I'm not a car guy. I'm
Mhm.
not a mechanic by any shape, form, or fashion. I know where to put the gas on a car, and I could probably figure out a way to change to check the oil.
Mhm.
And I know how to check my tire pressures and everything. But other than that, I am clueless when it comes to a car.
Mhm.
It is just I've always been fascinated by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And to me, there's nothing more extraordinary than somebody hopping into a race car, strapping in, and taking it to 200 miles an hour or
Mhm.
more. So close to so many other cars in competition. I think that's extraordinary.
Mhm.
So, that's what drew me to it was the passion for the sport and then just the sheer ability to be able to do that, and then the personality, and then the personalities that were involved.
Um, so before we had sites like J Ski or Toby Christie nowadays, there was NASCAR Scene, which you were a huge part of. In your opinion, what made the magazine so popular back then, but also something that people now look back on as being so iconic?
Basically, the newspaper was the only game in town. Now there was always National Speed Sport News, and that was a great publication, still is a great publication. But National Speed Sport covered a lot of different forms of motorsports. It could be the Indy 500, F1, sprints, whatever. And Grand National Scene, then Winston Cup Scene, and finally NASCAR Scene covered Winston Cup exclusively, and then added the Busch Series, what's now the Xfinity Series, and the Truck Series. So we were focused solely on the top three national divisions. And so I think at that time it was basically the only game in town. Now, that being said, there's something to be said for the riders who work there. They were, they were the best in the business, and me. And then our photographers, I will never, ever, ever talk about, Winston Cup Scene's place in the sport without mentioning our photographers. I would have put them up against anybody in all of sports, because they were so good at being in the right place at the right time. And when we had a race, when there was a race, we had photographers that would cover basically every square inch of the racing surface. And so we didn't miss much at all.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that made it such a big draw, but also just how in depth we were. You can see behind me, that's every single issue of that newspaper ever. And I would put this archive up against anything. It is the most complete record of what happened at the uppermost levels of NASCAR from May of 1977 through December of 2009. You will not find a better record, period, anywhere.
I know
So
for me,
that's what made it special.
I know for me, whenever I pick up a NASCAR Scene, because every so often on our Instagram page, I'll thumb through one and show some people some of the stories that were going on, because it really is a time capsule. Like I can open it up to 2007 July or whatever, and I can read right there what the saga is going on with Dell Jr. and DEI. But I can also go and see, well, at Michigan, here's what happened, but also every single driver. So maybe this guy didn't even qualify for the race, but there's still a plug in there saying like he didn't qualify, but he will be back next week. And I'm just like, it's not something you pick up and it just says, well, here's the top five. Here's what happened with them. It's no, here's what's going on in the sport. Here's what in this moment. Here's everything that's going on.
Yeah. And to be a writer at Winston Cup Scene, you had to have a sense of trust with the people that you covered. They, by and large, they knew that we weren't going to screw them, so to speak.
Yeah.
They knew that we were going to be fair. Now, we would be tough, and we would say and write what was on our mind and in our opinion, but we would be fair and objective. And I think that's another part of the equation, is that when you had that Winston Cup Scene shirt on and that logo, there was a sense of responsibility there. And people took notice of that. And it gave, and I'm not gonna lie, it gave us an immediate sense of credibility that people could trust us. So, yeah.
As a fan, I've enjoyed that your podcast range from in-depth interviews like the Scene Vault podcast. Sorry, my notes got mixed up right here. Um, but I've also enjoyed your shorter ones, like their Firestorm podcast early this year. Like it's one of my favorite podcasts of all time, as well as your most recent, the glorious white knuckled, God fearing, spun out and half turned over racing stories, which
Well,
focuses.
I tell you what, on the glorious show, I will say this. Shorthand,
Uh-huh.
we call it glorious racing stories.
There you go.
Now, I did tell Mike, I said, that's kind of presumptuous, isn't it? Call ourselves glorious racing stories, but yeah, that's shorthand. So you can just say glorious racing stories.
And so, with those two, they follow more of a format of being, between 15 minutes to 30 minutes, maybe long, and just covering a single topic. Like with the Firestorm, each one was, here is about Adam Petty, here's about Earnhardt, as well as, with the glorious racing stories. It'll be, here's this one story with Bobby Allison and all. Do you have a preference between the two versus like the shorter and like the longer? And do you ever find it challenging jumping back and forth, thinking, nope, this one has to be concise, whereas this one, we can just start the microphone and we can be here as long as we need to be?
Yeah. I'm going to be honest with you. The Firestorm series that I did earlier this year and the Glorious Racing Stories, those were my first attempts at what would be considered a scripted podcast. Steve Wade and I, when we do the Scene Vault podcast, we have notes.
Yeah.
And, if I have something that specifically that I want to say, I'll write that out beforehand. But by and large, it's basically off the cuff and spontaneous. The Firestorm and Glorious podcasts, that was a little bit of a learning curve. That was the first time I had ever gone off a straight script. And I think that you can tell it. The Firestorm and some of the earlier Glorious episodes, I was not used to narrating anything. And so when I started Firestorm and when I started Glorious, I basically just wrote out a script and I turned on the recorder and started reading. And so those first episodes, they were a little rough, I think. You never like to listen to yourself. But I do think, and I'll always be indebted to him, but Matthew Dillner sat down with me in the Dirty Mo studio and we went through a script. And, normally it had been taking me, if a script was 20 minutes long, it typically took me maybe 25 minutes to record it. Well, when I sat down with Matthew in the Dirty Mo studio, I had a 25-minute script and it took us 2 full hours. And we literally went through it line by line by line by line. And so, and at times phrase by phrase. And so it taught me how to focus, focus on certain phrases and emphasize certain phrases. And so Matthew really helped me out there. And I think, I'm never going to be Morgan Freeman narrating something. But I do feel a little more comfortable, and hopefully listeners will see that I'm getting a little bit better. So, and plus, I'll be honest with you, I feel like I owe it to the story. Because the stories that we've been able to tell on Glorious Racing Stories have been, I'm not patting myself on the back. I try not to pat myself on the back, but they deserve the best I can possibly put into it because those are truly good stories.
Yeah, well, not to pat yourself on the back too much, but as a fan, I really enjoy them because it's a great gateway into the older days of NASCAR. For me with those stories, but also with the newer stuff, like 2001 is when I really started focusing and following the sport, because I wanted to know what is going on, who's racing. It wasn't just let me put my Jeff Gordon hat on or my Earnhardt shirt. And because that's even why Firestorm, to me, it was almost like this opening this time capsule of thinking. I remember going through it and seeing that like Earnhardt had died, but not understanding it. And, with like Adam Petty, knowing like, okay, he passed away, but now going back and realizing who he was, like why it mattered so much, why the course of NASCAR is altered by these events, not just things happen, but it's no, things happen and the sport takes turns. A lot like your most recent Junior Johnson podcast, where it's like if Earnhardt goes to race there, you now think everything changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
When it comes to NASCAR stories, do you have one that stands out for whatever reason? Maybe it's just one of your favorites, or maybe it's most memorable, or maybe it's one that you look at and, like I just said, you say, if this story happens differently, the whole thing we call NASCAR is altered, now.
A question like that is almost impossible to answer, because I've been doing this for 30 years now, and I've done so many stories, and it's kind of funny to go through some of these old newspapers and see my byline, and I will have no memory whatsoever of writing that story. Now, that being said, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful interviews that we have done for the Scene Vault podcast, I think about Ricky Craven and the accident that he had at Talladega and then at Texas. And the Texas crash really changed the trajectory of his career. He said that he has memories and he can never get rid of those memories. So if that's PTSD, I would assume that would be what you call it. But he said that he has these very vivid memories of the helicopter rotor blades flying him to the hospital. And even saying that gives me chills.
Yeah.
Another one, and probably the most powerful 2 episodes of our podcast that we have ever done, or possibly ever will do, were with Lyndon Amick. And I interviewed Lyndon a couple of years ago and for the podcast. And so I knew going down to South Carolina about his story, leaving NASCAR and going and joining the National Guard, and then eventually winding up in Afghanistan. I actually traded emails with him while he was in Afghanistan. And for him to tell me via email that he had been involved in a 40-minute firefight, that was pretty powerful. But then when I went down to do the interview, we kind of took a break, and I came back into the room, and Lyndon was taking off his jacket, and his arms are covered in tattoos. And I don't have anything against tattoos. More power to you. I ain't doing that needle. No way, no how. And without thinking, I said, what in the world? Because I just had this image of him in my mind, and the Lyndon Amick that I knew in the Busch series was very straight laced. And I said, what in the world? What are you doing? What's with this? And he said, these are my post-Jesus tattoos. And again, without thinking, I said, no, you mean your pre-Jesus tattoos, because Christians don't get tattoos, I kind of got a little uppity with that. I kind of got a little judgmental. But he said, no, these are my post-Jesus tattoos. And he proceeded to tell me about cheating on his wife and their relationship being really bad at one time. And then he got impacted by the Lord, and they came together, they reconciled, and now he's the associate pastor of their church. And I looked down, and my computer was still recording. And I said, hold on a second. And I said, hold on, let me turn this off. And he said, no, I'll be glad to talk about it.
Uh-huh.
And so I think it was at that point when we became more than just another NASCAR podcast.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those were two very special interviews to me, episodes to me. I think of Cliff Champion telling us about his suicide attempts.
Mm-hmm.
I think about Michael McSwain talking about his struggles after he got out of the sport and being very, very open and honest about that, kind of raw. And to be honest with you, I had been down that road when I got out of NASCAR in 2004. It was a rough road for a few years. And so I was able to share my story with Michael. And again, I left the recorder going.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, yes, we tell NASCAR stories on this podcast, but very often they turn into human stories.
Yeah.
And so I think those are the stories that I relate to the most and respond to the most.
I think as a fan, that's something that has always stood out to me through your podcast. Like I said, going back to the days of Scene, but now with the podcast is there's all these people that have been in the sport, and it's almost like there's a select few that you've heard their story over and over. And we had Matthew Donor on here last year as a guest, and that was one of the coolest compliments I got. Was he, beforehand coming on, he had looked at some of the guests, and he was like, you have certain people in the sport that you've heard their story over and over and over again. You hear it, but he was going through the list, and he was like, this guy you didn't hear a story. Or like we had Charles Lewandowski on here, and growing up, his paint scheme, it was a Start Park car, but it was probably my favorite paint scheme of all time. And I told him, I was like, I know, looking back, that was a weekend that he's thinking, all right, I'm going to show up here, I'm going to drive 4 laps, then park my car and head home. Whereas here's
I'm going to look good doing it.
Yeah, and and what's funny is the car itself, they just slapped their number from their other car on it. So I look back on it and I'm like, oh, you can even see where it doesn't line up or whatever.
Right.
But here's this random kid in South Carolina going, man, that's such a cool paint scheme. And I feel like there's so many stories that I've learned via one or multiple of your podcasts from people that I look at the name. Same way goes for the Dale Jr. download. I heard someone one time say that every week they'll look at the name and go, I don't know that person. Then they listen to it and they go, man, that's my favorite guy ever. And the same way I feel like with the Scene Vaults is there's so many people that I look at, I've heard that name, but then I listen to it and I'm like, oh, man, I want to meet that guy. That guy's cool. Why did I not know about him?
Well, see, that's one of the major reasons why I enjoy doing a NASCAR history podcast, because by and large, we are telling stories that haven't been repeated over and over and over again. There are many, many, many NASCAR podcasts out there, but they're all talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And while we may not be interviewing week by week the most famous people in the sport, we're getting some really good stories.
Yeah.
And that's what I've enjoyed about being a journalist, talking about NASCAR. And, I've also written quite extensively about NASA spaceflight.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody you meet has a story.
Yeah.
And it may not be a good story. It may not be a happy story. It may not have a happy ending, but everybody has a story.
Mm-hmm.
And, Lyndon Amick, I will always go back to him. Lyndon Amick is, and I don't mean this as any disrespect to Lyndon, but he is by far the least known person that we've had on the show.
Mm-hmm.
But he is in the top 1 or 2 or maybe 3 stories that we've had on the show.
Mhm.
And so I will trade fame over a
Yeah.
good story any day.
Mhm.
Any day.
That's awesome. Um, Finishing up, I'd read recently, I believe it was Steve Wade that I saw one of his tweets that you were just the biggest fan of the Andy Griffith Show. So I was wondering, what is your favorite episode, if you can boil it down? Because maybe it's like NASCAR, and you look and say, well, there's hundreds of great stories.
Well,
So,
I can answer that one very easily.
mhm,
It's an episode from the first season called Opie's Charity.
mhm,
It does. Don Knotts is not in it, so Barney Fife is not in the episode. But Opie's Charity basically boils down to um, Andy is upset with Opie for not giving more money to the underprivileged children's drive. He only gives 3 cents,
mhm.
and that leads to one of the greatest comedic exchanges ever in any sitcom ever, where Andy is trying to explain the need for him to give more money, and he says there's 2.5 boys per square mile in this county, and Opie says, "Well, I've never seen one." Seen one what? A half a boy. Well, it's not half a boy. It's mathematics. It's a ratio or whatever. To which Opie responds, "Poor Horatio." And Ron Howard was, I think he was maybe 5
Mhm.
when he recorded that, and he was just that was the best job of any child actor I've ever seen. And then the payoff is that at the end of the episode, Andy has spent the entire episode fussing at Opie for not giving more money, and he's not truly concerned about the underprivileged children. He's concerned of what people are going to think of him.
Mhm.
I'm the sheriff in town,
Yeah.
and I'm the member of the fundraising committee and all that stuff. And at the end of the episode, Opie says that he's saving up the money so he can buy his girlfriend a coat because the one that she has is kind of worn out.
Mhm.
And so, that just hammers home for me 2 things. Number one, being too prideful and
Mhm.
being too proud. Andy's too proud of himself in this episode. But at the same time, it also, and it's a point that's been driven home in my life many, many times, that as a parent, you learn as much from your children
Mhm.
as you ever teach them. And so it's just a wonderful episode. And I actually do a series of Bible studies based on Andy Griffith's show.
Wow.
And no matter how many times I do that episode, wherever I go, that is always the first episode
Mhm.
that I do. And my poor wife and kids, they've heard that same episode 10,000 times. But that's how strongly and passionately I feel about it. That's just a truly good episode with a lot of good messages.
That's awesome. Well, if you're listening to this, I highly recommend you go check out some of Rick's current podcasts, as well as if you're ever in a random place and you see a NASCAR scene, pick it up. I don't care what it is, just grab it. There's gonna be great stories in there. An issue, that's what the word I was looking for.
They're called newspapers, youngster.
Well, Rick, it's been awesome getting to have you on this episode. I think it was but this is one of those episodes that it's cool to get to feature the story, but I think as a fan, even last night I was telling my wife, like, I get to interview Rick Houston tomorrow. This is so cool. So
you have very low standards.
Well, thanks for joining us, Rick.
All right, man.